What if the richest gold strike in 20 years was sitting under a mine that everyone had already given up on? Not a rumor, not a legend passed around a bar in Dawson City. An actual, measurable, laboratory-confirmed gold system, sitting quiet and untouched beneath a shaft that collapsed so violently that every company in the territory walked away from it and never looked back. That is exactly what one small, stubborn mining crew in the Yukon believes they found. And by the time you finish this video, you're going to understand exactly why some of the most experienced geologists in the North are calling this the strangest comeback story in modern placer mining. Stick around, because the drilling logs, the core samples, and the final decision this crew had to make are more dramatic than anything you have seen on a mining show this year. Let's start with the mine itself, because the backstory is what makes this whole thing so unbelievable. Nearly 2 decades ago, a shaft on a remote claim in the Yukon collapsed without warning. No one was seriously hurt, which everyone at the time called a miracle, but the ground above the tunnel gave way in a matter of seconds, swallowing equipment, support beams, and months of work. The mining company that owned the claim pulled out within a year. They filed their paperwork, wrote the site off as a loss, and moved their operation somewhere safer. For the next 18 years, that claim sat abandoned. Snow covered the collapsed entrance every winter. Alder brush grew up around the old equipment pads. Locals in the area started telling the same story you hear about a dozen mines across the north. Good ground, bad luck, not worth the risk. That was the story a small independent crew, led by a miner named Colt Bracken, inherited when he picked up the lease almost by accident 2 years ago. Colt wasn't looking for a miracle. He was looking for cheap ground he could work quietly while he built up capital for a bigger operation down the road. The old paperwork on the claim was thin, mostly handwritten notes, faded assay reports, and a few black and white photos of the shaft before it went down. But buried in one of those old assay reports was a strange detail that most people would have skipped right past. The gold-bearing layer in the historical records didn't taper off gradually the way it usually does when a deposit runs out. It just stopped, abruptly, at almost the exact same depth where the collapse had occurred years later. Colt is not a geologist by training. He is a working miner who has spent most of his adult life running equipment in freezing conditions, and he will be the first to tell you he is not the type to chase fairy tales. But that one detail stuck with him. He started digging through whatever records he could find, comparing old maps to newer satellite imagery, and slowly a theory started to form in his head. What if the collapse hadn't destroyed the gold system at all? What if it had simply sealed off the upper part of the tunnel, while the real body sat completely undisturbed somewhere deeper underground? It's an idea that sounds simple when you say it out loud, but proving it is a completely different challenge, and Colt knew it. A theory built off old paperwork and a hunch is worth exactly nothing to a bank, an investor, or a geologist. So instead of grabbing a drill and hoping for the best, Colt brought in an independent geological consultant to look at the ground from scratch, with no assumptions and no pressure to find anything. The first phase of the investigation was slow, almost boring by television standards. Ground-penetrating radar, magnetic surveys, a careful review of every old borehole record the crew could track down. The consultant's job at this stage wasn't to find gold. It was to figure out whether the ground below the collapse was even stable enough to safely explore, and whether there was any real geological reason to believe a continuous deposit existed down there at all. Weeks went by with nothing more exciting than data collection and long nights staring at survey printouts in a heated tent. Then the first anomaly showed up. The magnetic and radar data both pointed to a zone below the collapse point that behaved differently from the surrounding rock. It wasn't proof of gold. Rock structures can behave strangely for 100 boring reasons that have nothing to do with precious metal. But it was enough of a signal that the consultant recommended a small, carefully controlled drilling program to test the theory directly, rather than committing to a full excavation on a hunch. That is when things started to get interesting. The first 3 drill holes came back with encouraging but modest results, small traces of gold at multiple depths. Nothing that would make headlines on their own, but enough consistency across separate holes to rule out simple contamination or bad luck. It was the fourth hole that changed the tone of the entire camp. The core sample came up with a visible band of high-grade material running through it, thick enough that even people without a geology background could see it was different from anything pulled out of the first three holes. Colt has said in interviews since then that he made everyone stop, bag the sample separately, and get it into secure storage before anyone even celebrated, because he had seen too many exciting single samples turn into disappointing averages once the lab results came back. The lab results, when they finally arrived weeks later, did not disappoint. The assay confirmed grades well above what the crew was seeing on the surface deposits they had already been working. More importantly, follow-up holes drilled around that fourth sample kept hitting similar material, which is the detail that actually matters in resource estimation. A single rich sample can be an outlier. A consistent pattern across multiple holes in the same zone is the beginning of an actual resource. Over the following months, the crew expanded the drilling program carefully, adding holes one section at a time and waiting on lab confirmation before moving further. This is, frankly, the least exciting part of any real mining story, and it is also the most important. There were no dramatic collapses, no near misses, no chase scenes. Just methodical, patient work, cross-checking every new sample against the last, building a picture of the deposit one data point at a time. By the time the drilling program wrapped up, the independent geological consultant had enough information to put together a preliminary resource estimate. Based on current gold prices and the volume and grade of material identified so far, that estimate came in at roughly $135 million worth of gold still sitting in the ground. It's worth pausing here to be clear about what that number actually means, because it gets misunderstood constantly in this industry. A resource estimate is not a bank account. It is not gold sitting in a vault waiting to be picked up. It is a scientific estimate built from real data of how much gold likely exists in a specific zone based on the samples collected so far. Getting that gold out of the ground safely, legally, and profitably is an entirely different challenge, one that involves permitting, engineering, financing, and a lot of risk that never shows up in a headline number. Colt and his consultant have both said publicly that the number could shift once full-scale mining begins, either up or down, and that no one on the crew is treating $135 million as a guaranteed payday. That kind of caution is honestly what makes this story compelling instead of just another exaggerated internet claim. Colt refused every opportunity to turn this into a bigger story than the data supported. When a local paper wanted to run a headline calling it the biggest gold strike in the territory in a decade, he pushed back and asked them to include the word preliminary. When investors started reaching out after word got around the mining community, he turned down more than one offer because the terms would have forced him to rush production before the geological picture was fully understood. Because here's the part of this story that almost never gets told in mining videos. The ground above that old collapse is still unstable. Getting to the deeper gold zone doesn't mean walking back into the same tunnel that failed nearly 2 decades ago. It means building an entirely new access route, reinforced from the start, engineered specifically to avoid the conditions that caused the original failure. That work is slow, it is expensive, and it does not care how excited anyone is about a resource estimate. Colt brought in a structural engineer early in the process, specifically to make sure that no one on his crew would ever be put in the position the previous operators were in when that shaft first came down. As of now, the crew is still in the planning phase for that new access route. Permitting is underway. Additional drilling is being considered to firm up the edges of the resource estimate before any major capital is committed to full-scale extraction. It's not a fast-moving story, and it's definitely not a finished one. But it is a real one, built on actual survey data, actual assay results, and a level of patience that most people don't expect from a small independent mining crew working a claim that everyone else had already written off. What makes this whole situation stick with people isn't really the dollar figure, even though that's the number that gets the headlines. It's the fact that an abandoned piece of ground, one that an entire industry had quietly agreed was a dead end, turned out to be sitting on top of something worth taking seriously, simply because one miner noticed a strange detail in an old assay report and refused to let it go. Mining has always had stories like that buried in its history. Claims that got walked away from too early, ground that got misjudged because the people looking at it didn't ask the right question at the right depth. Most of those stories never get revisited. This one did, because someone was stubborn enough and careful enough to actually test the theory instead of just talking about it. Whether this deposit eventually gets fully mined out at the value the initial estimate suggests is still an open question, and anyone telling you otherwise right now is guessing. What we do know is that the science so far has held up, the drilling results have been consistent, and a mine that was left for dead nearly 20 years ago is now one of the more closely watched claims in the region. If the next phase of exploration and the new access route confirm what the early data is suggesting, this could end up being one of the more remarkable second chances in recent Yukon mining history. And if it doesn't pan out exactly the way the early numbers hint, it will still be a solid reminder of how much value can get left behind when an industry moves on too fast. If you want to see how this story develops, from the permitting process to whatever the crew finds once they finally reopen access to that deeper zone, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of slow burn mining story that tends to get forgotten right before the most interesting part happens.